Wade, it's wonderful to see you again. I know we saw you back in March, but thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And that meditative moment was truly what I needed, because to give a talk virtually is super hard. So that was really helpful. And I want y'all to be able to say hello to my family. That's what it looks like to take a family picture in a Piggly Wiggly in Louisiana. So yes. So thank you so very much. So I'm gonna get us started here. So I spent this morning with my usual habit of waking up about 2 hours prior to my partner to have some time to myself, to meditate, to read. And I usually watch a talk by someone who's doing some work in the world that's impactful to me. And this morning I was listening to a conversation between the famed civil rights lawyer, Bryan Stevenson, and the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and new author of the book Caste, Isabel Wilkerson. And they were both talking and sharing stories about their past. And Bryan Stevenson, who has argued in front of the Supreme Court, he told a story about how he was defending a client in court, and someone said something and did something very demeaning to him. And he talked about how in that moment, he had to maintain his composure and smile through his own humiliation. And I thought, wow, what's the cost to oneself when you have to smile through your own humiliation? And then I thought about, what's the cost when we don't interrogate what that does to us? And what's the cost when I humiliate someone else? And then I thought about our time together and the need for us to interrogate ourselves, to interrogate our histories in this moment when we're trying to power forward in the service of ourselves and invariably in the service of others. So now, as we dig into our time together, I want us to make some agreements to ourselves, because I believe that these agreements are paramount for us to start our journey to end systemic oppression, inequalities, and the like. So first, I would ask you all to try your hardest during this conversation and through the rest of your lives to be disinterested in needing to be right. And what that means is that being right is something that we teach our children. But as you become an adult, you understand that we will spend the majority of our lives existing in the gray. We'll be in the muck, no longer in the heavens. And that's where systemic oppression lives. So for this next conversation and this whole conference, please try to be disinterested in needing to be right and get more comfortable in the nuance and in the gray. And number two is, can we all be disinterested in needing to think of ourselves as good people? Because here's the truth. When you're advocating on behalf of someone else, when you're advocating on behalf of yourself, goodness is not your goal. The goal is to try to be a better person and learn to strive for better and not good. And to answer some questions, what are you doing to use your social, your economic, your political power and capital to end your oppression and someone else's? And number three, if at any moment during our conversation, if you start to feel a little bit uncomfortable, just refer back to 1 and 2, and I think that you'll feel okay. All right, so let's have a little fun now. Now, I potentially created a huge sin that I'm going to slightly change the focus of our talk. Because after I spent my time this morning and I was interrogating myself in this moment of Black Lives Matter, in this moment of women's rights being constantly under attack, in this moment of our transgender family members being murdered without consequence, I felt that we need to be able to step back in order to truly power forward, right? So sorry for the slight change, but this is really what's on my heart. And I want to ground this conversation with a quote by the Australian Indigenous activist, Leela Watson. And we'll use her quote as kind of our guiding principle going forward. And the quote is, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together." And this quote articulates what I believe is the most important and yet the most terrifying component of what it means to be in the dominant group when you're trying to fight on behalf of the marginalized group to end systemic oppression. Because ultimately, you will be fighting to end something that was created in your name. And to make that more clear, that oftentimes systemic oppressions are created in the dominant group's interests. So one of the ways to continue fighting to end systemic oppression that benefits you is to understand more intimately how this oppression inherently harms you. And this is what I believe is the first and ultimately most important step in fighting to end any form of oppression. And this phase is called interrogating one's own identity and one's own history. Because those of us who have identities that place us in positions of power, we have to do the work on the self to both understand the benefits and the harm of being in a position of power. Now, many of us are well versed in how our majority status, how it benefits us. But many of us have never dared to understand how we're harmed. So if you identify as white, you have to interrogate, how does anti-Blackness and racism harm you? If you identify as a man, how does sexism and misogyny harm you? If you identify as cisgender and heterosexual, how does homophobia, heterosexism, and transphobia, how does that harm you? And to understand what that harm is, it requires us to have more than an intellectual investment. It requires a personal and emotional investment. Because it's not always obvious what it takes, because it takes a willingness to give up something. And many of us have never thought to name that we're going to have to give up our power. And sometimes we're going to have to give up our very names. For example, those of us who identify as white, you will have to give up your identity as white. And ultimately, you will have to give up your power. Because when you learn what the core import of whiteness is, it's really power. And you, as a white identified person, have to figure out why, and then what, and then how. And you have to ask yourself questions like, why do I identify as white? Where did the term white come from? Why, when, and how did my ancestors, who may be from France, who may be from Ireland, who may be from Italy, why did they ultimately name themselves as white when they got to America? Now that may sound like a riddle, but let me attempt to make that much more real. Because when you do the work of self-interrogation, you have to go back to when you were a child. And when I was a little boy, there was a moment, an almost unremembered moment, when I learned that the world offered me certain advantages, certain access, certain forms of power, and therefore certain forms of safety that because I identified as a boy, but that the world confirmed that identification and allowed me to name myself as a boy and to name myself as male. And I use the language of allow me to identify as a boy because there are many people who have named themselves as male or as a man. And because of nefarious reasons, the world declines their invitation and identification. And having the ability to name oneself is about power. And that power often extends to give you the ability to name someone else, because that's what power ultimately is. So when you do the emotional and personal labor of interrogating being labeled and labeling yourself, and when I labeled myself as a boy, I thought about all of the freedom that came with that. As a boy, I can remember my sister and the other girls that existed in my neighborhood always being told to cover themselves, or to go put some clothes on, or to cross their legs, or to close their legs, or to smile, or to go pretty yourself up. There was a hyper policing of their bodies, of their identities, of their expressions. And that restricting of their bodies, identities, and expressions, I didn't go through. No one ever told me to smile more, close or cross my legs, or to go put a shirt on. Now, when it's faced, that may feel and sound only harmful to girls. But when I did the interrogation of self, when I interrogated my history, I learned that I was harmed as well. Because in order to constrict the identities, the expressions of one group, you inevitably must constrict the identities and the expressions and the bodies of all groups. And it was my job to find out how, what, and why. Now I could give you those answers, but that's your work to actually do. Just like it was my work and the work of many men who want to be allies and do the work to end sexist oppression. You've got to go and find out your why, your what, and your how. And if you don't, then you've skipped what I believe is the most paramount phase to advocating on behalf of others and attempting to end any form of systemic oppression. And that is the phase of self-interrogation. Because if you don't understand your own history, your own choices, you run the risk of being an ally whose work is truly hollow. And that, as my grandmother says, when the shit gets thick, you get thin. And this work is truly important because after you do this work, you will no longer ask any oppressed group, what can I do to help? Because that question in itself highlights a level of innocence that no one should have. You don't deserve the power to at once be the oppressor of the minority group and then double their burden by asking them, what should you do to end that oppression? Because when you do the work of self-interrogation, you no longer ask folks about their experience. If you identify as white, you will no longer ask a Black person to help you understand what it means to be Black in this world. Because when you understand what it fundamentally means to be white, you invariably know what it means to be Black. If you know what it means to identify as a man, you understand what it means to identify as a woman. Now, you won't have their lived experience, but you will immediately know, based on what you do and don't have access to, what they do and don't have access to. And if you feel safe in your identity, it's probably a good chance that they feel unsafe in theirs. Now, I know that this is true because if you were to ask a man, would he like to experience the world as a woman, he will smile. He will somewhat laugh and say no. If you ask a white person, would they like to be Black? They will smile and they will say no. And the truth lies underneath the answer to that question. Now, after you do the work of self-reflection to understand how you benefit and are at once harmed by any form of systemic oppression, the rest of the work will become axiomatic and it will be deeply personal, causing you to throw yourself in the work to end any form of oppression. But oftentimes, what we have to overcome is fear, because you have to risk it all to overcome your fear. Fear can be debilitating, but once you walk through that fear, you will own yourself for the first time. Now, some of you may or may not know that I used to play in the NFL. And while in the NFL, I wasn't open about my identity as a gay man. And I held on to the fear of losing everything if I told the world that I was gay. And the greatest fear that I had to overcome was the fear that if my mother knew I was gay, that she would reject me and no longer allow me to be in her life. But I knew if I didn't tell her, that she would not only be in control of her life, but mine as well. So after I finally told her that I was gay, we did not speak for close to 2 years, except for on holidays. And even though I had expressed to her my sexuality, I still did not feel free. I hadn't unburdened myself of that fear, which meant that I didn't own myself. I wasn't my own person. I would never truly be able to power forward unless I took control of my own destiny. Because again, that's what the word power means. Power is the ability to control one's own destiny and the destiny of others. And at that point, I hadn't taken my power back. So after many days and months of self-interrogation, which requires radical candor with yourself first and then others, I realized what must be done. I had to walk through a certain type of fear, the fear that without my mother's love and approval, that I could not survive. Because I was the type of child who was raised to be extremely subservient. And that meant that I would always be the child to my mother. And in some ways that I would never own myself in the world if I did never risk it all. So I called my mother, and during a very tense conversation, I said to her very quietly, but matter-of-factly, I said, "Mother, I want you in my life, but I do not need you." And I hung up the phone. And though it was the hardest thing I had ever done, I had never felt more alive, more powerful, more of myself. And today, my mother and my partner, they're thick as thieves, and they talk and they text and they tweet and they make me sick with their mushiness. But those moments would not be possible without me powering forward and walking through fear, because I had to risk something in order to gain something else. And before that moment, I never realized that by risking something, I would gain myself. I gained a greater understanding of myself and my relationships with others. And those relationships changed because I risked something. Change doesn't happen without great risk. As a society, we cannot move forward. We cannot power forward without great risk. And when those of us who exist in the dominant group risk something, when we give up something, we gain ourselves. We gain more of our humanity, and we become closer to each other. And when we take those great risks to go against the power structure, a power structure that's often invisible, yet omnipresent and highly adaptable. But that power structure and that oppression is born out of fear. And that fear is its weakness, because fear can be overcome. But as I said earlier, first you must face it. And that almost always means facing oneself and overcoming oneself. And the only way to do that, and this may sound like pie in the sky, but I personally know it's true, is with self-love. Because love cannot be overcome. It can only be walked away from. So I'm asking you all to overcome your fear and walk towards love. And that's how we will end systemic oppression. Now, before I close, I want to ask you all a couple questions. And if you can start to think about how to answer these questions, you can think about what is your role to free our world of systemic oppression. If our world was free of systemic oppression, how would you be different? How would your relationships with people who did not share your same identity change? How different would your children be? How different would your partners be? How different would your friendship group look? And then ask yourself, how different would your workplace be? What would it feel like? How would the conversations be different? How differently would you act? How would your history of bosses be different? Because when we start to reimagine ourselves, then we automatically must reimagine our workplaces. And these questions can only be answered after you know who you are, because you must dream of a different world, but you must grow and evolve for that to happen. And I want to leave you all with a poem by the great Lucille Clifton that I believe reminds us all that fear and hate always fail, and that love overcomes. And the poem is called, "Won't You Celebrate With Me?" Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here on this bridge between starshine and clay. My one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Thank you. I look forward to a Q&A now.
Thank you. That you always have this ability to share such like thought-provoking questions. So I found myself thinking that through, but that was wonderful. Thank you. We have a few questions from the audience, but I wanted to start with, and it plays to one of those questions that you were just asking us. Once you've interrogated yourself, once you've reflected yourself and taken on that personal transformation, how do you turn that into societal change? And how does it apply to the corporate world? So if the act of self-interrogation requires personal and emotional investment, if we kind of macro that to a company or a brand, what approaches are you seeing companies take to really sort of take this seriously and to own it?
Yeah, so one of the most important things about the self-interrogation phase, right, is that oftentimes when you're thinking about the idea of allyship, allies often ask, what can I do to help, right? What the quote that I started with, what it framed is that you can't help me. What you can do is work with me because our liberations are tied together. As long as we think that I'm doing this for you and not with you, then the work will never truly be personal. So let's think about the relationship of a CEO with their chief diversity officer, right? The true chief diversity officer in any organization should be the CEO. If the CEO doesn't fundamentally understand the value of diversity and inclusion and can articulate that, not from a talking point standpoint, but from a deeply emotional, personal place, then it will always be hollow because that's someone else's job. Imagine you work for any company who is going to be acquiring another company. Would the CEO outsource that to someone else in, let's say, mergers and acquisition? No, that CEO would be intimately involved because they know that if this fails, right, then that CEO is ultimately held responsible. Then why are we outsourcing diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? I'm not saying that we don't need those I&D officers, but the CEO should be intimately involved and should figure out, how do I make sure that everything that happens in my organization, I&D is undergirded in it? But your CEO can never truly understand that if they don't answer the question, what happened in my life that allowed me to get to this point? What about my identity potentially gave me a leg up? What's happening at my C-suite level, at my board level? How does it need to change? What risks do I need to take in order for that to happen, right? So you can't answer any of those other questions if you can't answer any questions about yourself, right? Because it takes a lot of courage for someone in a position of power to state that potentially they didn't get there because of their own merits, right? And all of us know if you're on a job, absent of your race, your gender, any of your multiple identities, there was someone's neck who you were standing on, right? And if you can't own that, if you can't answer that, if you can't get rid of your shame and your guilt around that, you will always be responding to these issues as if they're not your own. So the self-interrogation piece really is about making this deeply, deeply personal so that you understand that everything I do on my job has to make sure that I'm taking other people's impact, involvement involved in, and it's not about them, it's about us.
And after the devastating murder of George Floyd and countless others, and the racial demonstrations, there was a flurry of activity from brands coming out and sort of stating what they stood for, and I think owning it. But I'm interested in your perspective on, are they owning it, or was it a moment in time, and are they walking the walk as well as talking the talk?
So here's the question that I've asked many leaders is, okay, you're doing this now, wonderful. What caused you to not do this before? And again, if you can't answer that question, you skipped phase one, right? Because if you're advocating on behalf of a group, right, and with that other group, you need to be able to articulate, where were you in 2018, 2017, 2016? Like, what has actually happened? Not why, but what? And what I push folks to do is to not ask so many why questions, but ask what questions, because what questions gets to specifics. What questions doesn't force a person to feel judged, but a what question means that I've actually thought about the answer. So I am really grateful for many of the organizations, including some that I've worked for or consulted for, who have now taken stands. But what has changed? And what are you going to do differently now? Like, what's your accountability, not for your organization, but for you as the leader? If you can't name your accountability and your responsibility and how you're tying your metrics for hiring, for retention, for promotions, all of those things must exist, but there needs to be, the CEO should be accountable if you don't reach those goals, because the CEO would be accountable if you didn't reach some other goals, similar to the merger and acquisition. If a merger and acquisition fails, the senior leader is held responsible. Why are they not held responsible for I&D? And they should want to be held responsible. So you can always tell if an organization is truly invested in I&D, if the senior leader is the most responsible and is willing to risk their job, right? Because if you are a parent and you're raising your child and your child does terrible in school, you feel responsible for that. Like, you as a parent feel responsible. I want CEOs to feel the same level of responsibility, have the same level of consequences if D&I fails, as if any other part of the business fails.
I couldn't agree more. And I think there's something really interesting about, as CEOs, when we look at the health of a company, or as boards, when we look at the health of a company, let's not just look at the balance sheet, but actually let's look at some of these other measures. And actually that should be integrated. It shouldn't be a separate board or a separate initiative. It should be core and part of the conversation in the boardroom.
No, it's so true. It's so true. And again, reporting structures and reporting lines tell you where the priorities are, right? If, most things that are really a priority, reporting to the CEO, does I&D, right? Does, like, what's the accountability for the senior leaders if I&D, if the retention numbers of women of color start to drop? Who's responsible for that? If I were to interview at your organization and I ask the senior most leader, help me understand why your board looks the way it does, why your C-suite looks the way it does. I'm not interested in an intellectual answer. I want you to be deeply personal. I want you to have some skin in the actual game. And oftentimes that's not what's happening.
I want to go to a question that's come in from Regina Campbell. Regina, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Hi, Regina.
Hi. Such a great, important conversation. So I'm grateful for this important dialogue. And so I wanted to ask, how do you see the mindset of scarcity, which often is a common thing of how it impacts people's willingness to do self-interrogation, but also deal with D&I inequity? I think sort of culture is that if I help or give a little to someone else, that takes away from me. So the mindset of scarcity, I think, also impacts this. So I think, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So when you talk about scarcity, what I believe that people are really saying is that, hey, the workplace was created for me, right? If the workplace was created for everyone, then no one would have ownership of it, and then no one would feel afraid if we start to bring in more women, more people of color, more LGBTQ folks, more folks who are disabled, right? But when people fundamentally believe that this workforce or that our corporate world was created for them, then they do feel as if they're losing something when you have people who don't look like them into the workplace. And the space of self-reflection means that you have to own that. You have to own that you were groomed. Like, I'll use I statements. I was groomed as a man that every book that I read when I was a kid, right, whether it was the history books or any type of a industry book, typically the story was about a man. It was like right now there are more men named James who are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies than there are women. So that tells you that men have been groomed to believe that this industry was by them and for them. So I grew up as a boy believing that I deserve to have a job in the corporate world because I'm a man. And when I see people who don't look like me entering into this corporate space, I go, well, wait a minute, this is my space. You're taking up my space. Actually, it's everyone's space. And I have to own the fact that I was taught to believe that. And then I got to interrogate what that means. What does that say about me? What does that say about our world? What does that say about everyone else who doesn't look like me, who tries to enter into a corporate world? So the point of scarcity is so true. But what I had to learn is that if we work together, if we can co-create a society, if we can co-create a workplace, the pie expands. It expands, right? Like it is not a one size, a loser take all or an us versus them. But if I think of myself as the us and you as the them, that scarcity model will always exist. And I've got to own that first before I can hope to overcome that fear.
Thank you, Regina. Wade, I've got to ask, just to close up, I know you said you publicly spoke out about what it was to be like being closeted and gay while you were playing in the NFL. How have you seen the sort of sports space change, and do you see more players and athletes owning who they are now?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that our sports world reflects our larger world, right? And they impact each other. So even though there is not one openly gay man in any of our big five sports, there are a lot more players who are coming out within their teams who just want to be able to tell their coach who's a father figure or a teammate who is a brother figure, right? Or an uncle figure. So what you're seeing is that there aren't a lot of players who are coming out to the public, but there are who are coming out in their more intimate spaces. And similar to how I needed to only tell my mother, I don't have a responsibility to tell the rest of the world. I have a responsibility to myself to make sure that I'm comfortable with me before I invite you in. And I prefer the language of inviting in versus of the language of coming out, because what coming out, it connotes a certain level of hiding, of deviance, right? Being LGBTQ is not anything but being human. So LGBTQ folks, to me, don't come out of some closet with smelly shoes and wire hangers, but we use the language of Darnell Moore, who says, we invite the world in. And you have to earn to be invited in, right? So as our world grows, as the sports world starts to expand, you will see more athletes who invite the world in, but the sports world has a responsibility to publicly name that they're a welcoming space, a psychologically safe space for folks who identify as LGBTQ+. But they got to do more than just say it. They've actually got to speak to why and what happened in their past that would have created the conditions for athletes to feel as if identifying as gay would not be welcome. Yeah.
Wade, we could speak for hours on this topic, and I that was such a powerful conversation. Thank you so much, and such a beautiful poem as well. It was "Won't You Celebrate Me" by Lucille Clifton. That's right, isn't it? Wade, good luck with everything you're working on. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for being on here.
Thank you all, and continue to power forward.
Thank you.